The common belief is that flamethrower operators on Iwo Jima were elite shock troops, rare specialists whose danger was matched by their protection, men encased in steel and flame who terrified the enemy and therefore dictated the terms of battle. The contrarian truth is colder and more terminal. They were not armored demigods, but walking fuel reservoirs, statistically pre-selected for death by the physics of their own equipment and the terrain they were ordered to cleanse. Their annihilation was not incidental to the battle, it was engineered by it. The context begins with the machine itself. The M22 flamethrower carried nearly 70 pounds of pressurized fuel and propellant, strapped vertically to the operator's spine. It was not armor, but exposure, a tall, rigid silhouette rising above the volcanic sand. On Iwo Jima's black slopes, where cover was scarce and every inch of elevation was pre-sighted by Japanese gunners, this profile mattered. Application followed instantly. A single rifle round piercing the tank did not need to ignite the fuel to kill the man wearing it. The concussive rupture alone could break spines, liquefy organs, or pin a burning corpse beneath his own collapsing gear. When ignition did occur, it was not cinematic. It was suffocation, flash combustion, and thermal shock so fast that men died screaming only if they were lucky. The framing exposes the global glitch. Systems that optimize for battlefield effect without accounting for human survivability create roles that function as disposable interfaces, a logic that persists wherever efficiency outruns ethics. The common belief is that Japanese defenders were simply afraid of fire, that flamethrowers broke morale and therefore saved American lives overall. The contrarian truth is that fear cut both ways and was weaponized against the men carrying it. Japanese doctrine on Iwo Jima identified flamethrower operators as priority targets, not because they were rare, but because they were predictable. The context is doctrinal clarity. Defensive orders instructed gunners to wait, to let riflemen and grenadiers pass, and to fire only when the flame units exposed themselves. Application meant that flamethrower men were often the last in a squad to advance, and the first to be isolated. When they fell, their squads stalled, pinned by the sudden absence of the one tool designed to neutralize caves. The framing reveals a systemic echo. When an institution builds its tactics around single points of failure, adversaries adapt faster than planners admit, and the cost is paid in bodies before memos. The second best forensic audit of their destruction lies in the terrain. Iwo Jima was not a battlefield, but a furnace of pulverized basalt. The sand swallowed boots, slowed charges, and forced men upright as they fought to move. The context is geophysical. Every step required effort. Every fall exposed the back. Application was immediate. Flamethrower operators, already burdened, tired faster, fell more often, and took longer to rise. Each stumble was an invitation. Snipers waited for the moment a man knelt, when the tanks aligned perfectly with a firing lane. The framing widens the lens. Environments are not neutral stages, they are active participants, and systems that ignore terrain as a killing agent repeat the same error in deserts, jungles, and cities still burning today. The best audit, placed second to complete the wave, is logistical. Flamethrowers were never meant to survive prolonged engagements. The context is supply chain reality. Fuel was limited, refills were slow, and operators had to approach within terrifyingly close range to be effective. Application turned proximity into a death sentence. To burn a cave, a man had to stand within 30 yards of a hidden enemy who had days to map that exact distance. Each burst announced his location with a plume of fire and smoke visible across the island. The act of using the weapon was a flare calling death. The framing exposes the terminal logic of the system. Tools designed for short-term breakthroughs are often misused as long-term solutions, and the humans bound to them absorb the mismatch. By the end of the first days on Iwo Jima, casualty reports showed a pattern too consistent to dismiss. Flamethrower teams were being erased at rates approaching total loss, not because the men were reckless, but because the system required them to be visible, slow, and indispensable. Their deaths were the biological liquidation of a tactical idea that looked sound on paper and murderous in practice. The global glitch is already visible here. When institutions measure success in cleared objectives rather than surviving operators, liquidation becomes a feature, not a failure, and the fire consumes its carriers before it ever reaches the enemy. The common belief is that flamethrower casualties were simply the price of close combat, an unfortunate but unavoidable byproduct of fighting an entrenched enemy in volcanic terrain. The contrarian truth is more precise and more damning. Flamethrower operators were not merely exposed to danger, they were structurally denied survivability by the way American infantry doctrine fused speed, spectacle, and terror into a single human chassis. Their deaths were not random, they followed a repeatable pattern as clean as an autopsy incision. The context begins at squad level. Flamethrower teams were typically assigned as attachments rather than organic elements, brought forward when resistance stiffened. They were inserted late into engagements already saturated by enemy fire. Application turned this timing into slaughter. By the time a flamethrower man moved up, Japanese defenders had already revealed firing ports, measured distances, and adjusted fields of fire. The operator advanced into a solved equation. He was not discovering the enemy, he was stepping into pre-calculated death. The framing exposes a global glitch in how institutions treat specialists. When expertise is deployed reactively instead of structurally integrated, the expert absorbs the accumulated risk of everyone else's delay. The common belief is that flamethrowers shortened battles by clearing caves quickly. The contrarian truth is that they often prolonged contact and increased casualties precisely because of how they had to be used. The context is mechanical limitation. Flamethrowers could not arc fire or saturate depth. They required line of sight. Application meant that operators had to expose themselves directly to cave mouths, often standing upright to angle the nozzle correctly. Japanese defenders understood this geometry intimately. Grenades rolled downhill toward exposed legs. Machine gun bursts stitched the height of the fuel tanks. Mortars pre-registered collapsed entrances the moment flame appeared. The framing reveals a systemic failure. When a weapon's operating envelope is narrower than the doctrine built around it, human bodies become the adjustable margin. The second best forensic audit in this chapter lies in medical reality. Injuries sustained by flamethrower operators were uniquely catastrophic. The context is trauma science. Even without ignition, penetration of pressurized tanks caused overpressure waves that shredded internal organs. When fuel burned, it adhered to skin, burned through clothing, and continued to combust even as men ran or fell. Application translated into deaths that medics could not reverse. Burns contaminated with volcanic ash turned into infections within hours. Airway damage suffocated survivors days later. Flamethrower men who lived long enough to reach aid stations often died anyway, quietly, away from the cameras. The framing expands outward. Systems that create injuries beyond the capacity of their own medical infrastructure are not waging war, they are outsourcing death to biology. The best audit, placed second to complete the comprehension wave, is psychological. Flamethrower operators were marked men long before they were hit. The context is perception. Both sides recognized the flamethrower as a symbol of annihilation. For the Japanese defenders, killing the flame carrier was not just tactical, it was moral retaliation. For American units, the flamethrower man carried an unspoken dread. Everyone knew he would be targeted. Application manifested in subtle ways. Operators were unconsciously given more space in formations. They advanced with fewer bodies shielding them because no one wanted to be next to the walking inferno. Isolation preceded impact. When fire came, it came to a man already standing alone. The framing identifies a recurring glitch. Roles that attract symbolic violence also attract social distance, and distance is lethal in any system that pretends cohesion is automatic. As days ground on, replacement flamethrower operators were pulled from regular infantry